Okay, so an interesting story emerged this week concerning a possible portable PlayStation handheld, a machine that will be built around the same kind of architecture that's being used for PlayStation 6. There's going to be apparently a handheld machine and a proper console. Details have emerged via a reputable leaker, Kepler L2, and man, there's a lot of interesting detail here. Oliver, what's the score here?
Yeah, so basically this story amounts to some kind of cryptic posts that Kepler has laid out on NeoGAF, I believe. And basically he's laying out the spec for a future PlayStation portable type console. And I think the key kind of numbers here are that he's talking about a 3 nanometer process technology, which is not currently used in GPUs, but is going to be used for NVIDIA's Rubin architecture and presumably their future consumer GPUs as well. And he's also talking about a 15-watt power limit for that chip. And he's also detailed some other specs here, like he's talking about, running PS5 games, but not at the same resolution and frame rate. In that case, you'd presume that it would run PS5 games with a patch there. He's saying that he thinks the estimated performance is somewhere between Xbox Series S and PS5, which is certainly very intriguing and very appealing. And he's talking about it taping out a couple months after the regular PS6 SoC, so presumably in time for maybe a 2027 launch somewhere in that region. That's at least what we're supposing based on certain rumors right now. That could be in the ballpark of where it's going to launch there. And he unsurprisingly says it's going to be a lot less than 40 CUs there as well, which is not too surprising in response to someone's question. So I think this is pretty appealing. I mean, 15 watts is a good power target for something that might be a portable system. You might want to run it for like 2 hours at peak load. That would be a reasonable amount of power for it to draw. Certainly we see that with Steam Deck, and with 2 node jumps above the Steam Deck, that gives you hopefully quite a lot of additional performance on top. I think it'll be much more powerful than, say, a PlayStation 4, for instance. So in that case, of course, I'd hope for full PS4 BC and then integration into PS5 and PS6. But I think that integration is going to be interesting because on PS5, you can imagine they could patch titles, right? It won't work with unmodified games, you'd presume. Unless Sony has cracked some incredible power that we're not aware of, they should not be able to run those games unmodified. But on PS6, what would it be? Would it be a baseline requirement for games, or would it be patched in on a game-by-game basis there as well? Would it be the kind of thing that developers can overlook, or would it be part of the fundamental next-gen spec? I'd kind of lean more towards that latter possibility because I think games need to scale to as many platforms as possible to justify their very inflated development budgets these days. And so I think with graphics being as scalable as they are in this age of ray tracing and machine learning, I'd expect more scalability into next generation with possibly a portable Xbox. You've got the Switch 2, obviously, at the extreme end of the scale. And then you've got some of this portable PlayStation stuff going on that could possibly fill that area beneath the PS5, but still with that current generation feature set of the PS6. So yeah, I think this is very intriguing. I think there are a couple other technical details that would be curious to learn about here. I'd be curious to see what the CPU architecture is. I'd be curious to see what the CPU configuration is. You'd presume it would be like at least 8 Zen 6 cores, Zen 5 cores, something like that, right? I'd also presume it would have to have quite a lot of RAM, probably 16 gigabytes minimum to run the games that you want it to run here, realistically. And it also needs to have some scheme, I'd imagine, for expandable storage. So you can almost think of like an M.2 bay, but only fitting maybe a 2230 chip there. Mm-hmm. So just a small M.2, like we see in the ROG Ally, for instance, where you can swap that out. You just have the choice of that really small SSD sizing there for the M2, but that should be fine for a system like this. So yeah, just some overall thoughts. I think it's an interesting leak. I'm certainly finding this very appealing myself. But yeah, I'm very curious to see how Sony will approach this one.
Mm-hmm. Alex, what do you make of all of this?
Well, it's pretty interesting because if it's coming out apparently after the PS6 is coming out, I don't think it's going to be some sort of like weird in-between architecture. Rather, I'd be thinking you'd be using whatever version of RDNA. They're not going to call it that. Probably then it's going to be UDNA. Mm-hmm. I imagine it's going to be using the same thing as that with all the backwards compatibility hardware features that are required to make it and possibly run PS4 and PS5 games, including probably like the slightly not complete CU that is used for like Tempest audio. and stuff like that. I imagine all that would have to be in there, and that would mean this is not like Kepler would say, this is not some sort of Strix product at all. This is completely custom, purpose built for all of the stuff that makes the Sony ecosystem run. In terms of like how interesting it is as a product itself, though, it would have to, like Oliver said, beyond the PS4 backwards compatibility, which I think by that point in time, the hardware shrink would make that you could just run a PS4 game, I think, completely fine, no issue at all. Unlike a Steam Deck right now, for example, which has to reduce resolution and settings at times to even get that like PS4 level of performance in the GPU side. But there, I think by that point in time, we'll be there. But that's backwards compatibility. For the PS5 catalog, there's just, there's going to be, by that point in time, hundreds of thousands of games, that will have not had this support in their ecosystem for lower resolutions, lower frame rate targets, and stuff like that. In which case, it's going to have a, title per title update, as well as presumably the vast cross-gen catalog that's going to be coming out around the time and thereafter. Sorry, I just smashed my mic here. I mean, that's cool. PS4 backwards compatibility is cool, but kind of not getting all those PS5 games potentially that do exist out there, because I don't think every developer is going to update their game, and I don't think every, especially developers that don't exist anymore. So that's not the cool part about it. We talked about this number of months ago now when the rumors started coming about. I think John was on the cast then, and I mentioned this is one of the nice benefits of having Xbox Series S, is that you do have these performance profiles already in existence that run on lower end hardware. In which case you have the entire catalog, not just BC of an old system, but also the BC of the 4K twins, as I've called them in the past. So I think that's great for the Xbox side, but not as great as a Cell. I'd be curious to see what also it has, like all the DualSense in that factor. I'd be curious about if it is targeting 15 watt. I'd be curious about battery life, because these handhelds can get pretty big if they want to target longer battery life. And I think that's, like, for me, the most important part of a handheld, if I were to use one, would be battery life, actually. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff, but it's cool to have such specific information already. This thing's looking more real every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I want to quickly talk about the PS4 back compat, because obviously the concept of being able to run an entire library of PlayStation 4 games on a handheld at native resolution would be pretty awesome, I think. Today you could put out an Xbox 360 handheld, and I think it would do really well.
Oh, it would do well. Yeah,
I think it'd be great. So the concept of doing that for PS4, I think it's viable, because PS4 had 18 CUs. I think they could probably get 18 CUs minimum into a handheld for enhanced compatibility. I also think that AMD have got hardware backwards compatibility for GCN built into RDNA 2, and I don't see any reason why they wouldn't put it into UDNA if Sony is such a huge customer, and indeed Microsoft. So this is slightly different to Switch 2, which is using a translation layer for backwards compatibility. For the PlayStation and Xbox, AMD has kind of taken care of that for their biggest customers, or their big customers rather. So the concept that this thing could actually just run PS4 games with pretty simple compatibility. I mean, what did we have? It was like an 800 megahertz GPU.
Yeah.
Built on GCN, and 1.6 gigahertz Jaguar CPUs. I mean, just if clock for clock should be easily doable in a handheld. So that is potentially very, very exciting. Some things that caught my eye from these leaks from Kepler L2 here. Let's talk about power. Somewhere between Series S and PS5. Now, the thing about Series S is everybody says, it's the weaker platform and whatnot. But the bottom line is it's a 7-nanometer chip with like 20 CUs, drawing about 80 watts total. So the concept of being able to scale down that performance and some more all I can really say is that 3 nanometer must be astonishingly good, and slash or the new GPU architecture has to be a kind of leap in the order that we saw with RDNA 2 versus RDNA 1, which in turn made stuff like the Steam Deck possible. And maybe that's what Valve is waiting for before there is actually a Steam Deck 2. But, you know, a machine that's between Series S and PlayStation 5 in handheld form running at 15 watts, that's incredibly ambitious. But there is some talk there that they are actually designing it around low voltages and whatnot. The concept that there's less than 40 CUs, I think people might be raising that based on the Strix Halo chip that AMD has put out, ostensibly a mobile chip, but it is pretty big. I guess the other thing I've kind of really interested about here is the concept of how big the die actually is and how expensive it is to make, because we've got Strix point handhelds out there, but they're commanding pretty big price premiums. We're going to be getting the Z2 Extreme later on this year, which is pretty much, well, very similar, I'd imagine. Going to be curious as to how they can actually make this viable for a mainstream product. Maybe they just have, you know, economy of scale in the way that these handheld chips don't have at the moment. I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot going on here and a lot of big question marks. This concept of running PS5 games at the same resolution frame rate, just not at the same resolution frame rate, mainly due to lower memory bandwidth. Well, that's the thing, right? That's been the major limiting factor of handhelds since Steam Deck. AMD has beefed up the CPU, beefed up the GPU significantly from Steam Deck to where we are now with Strix. And the performance gains at 15 watt aren't actually monumentally fantastic. So is memory bandwidth still an issue for this new machine? Kind of suspect it probably will be, because memory controllers occupy a lot of die space. So, yeah, I mean, exciting stuff, right? But it's all got to be proven out. The other thing I will say, though, having said all of that, is, you know, I'm just thinking back to the PlayStation Vita, which came about in the PlayStation 3 era, essentially. And, well, what can I say? They did some really good ports of PS3 games to Vita, even though the GPU was actually running at a really slow clock. It was a good GPU. And it was all down to developer ingenuity, which is exactly the argument we're making for Switch 2, and the fact that we should still see some pretty good results, even though, you know, the hardware isn't state of the art. Yeah, any further thoughts, Oliver?
No, I completely echo your thoughts on the memory bandwidth issue. That's like my number one concern here. So would they go to a bigger memory interface, but then we're concerned about die size all of a sudden? Would they throw more cache on there? Again, die size is a concern. What do they do there? Because I think in terms of GPU compute, you can get there. In terms of CPU, you know, horsepower, you can get there. That's all stuff that they've proven can scale, but can you scale it while getting meaningfully better performance? Then, of course, you know, the PS4 technically on a raw metrics level will probably still have much more memory bandwidth, right? Unless it's like a super wide memory bus. So that's another thing that might possibly throw a wrinkle in things. Obviously, there are other technologies that might come into play there, but there's also LPDDR6, which I think is coming online in the next couple of years. I don't know if that will be ready for PS6 or PS6 Portable or whatever this ends up being called, but I think that should be able to help quite a bit here. So if that's online, maybe that's less of an issue.
I got some supporter questions here. This one from Dajarko, in brackets, Dan. The leaked specs for Sony's PS6 adjacent handheld suggest a sort of handheld 1080p PS5, which seems almost ironic when you consider that Sony didn't have a quote-unquote low-spec SKU like Microsoft did with the Series S. So won't Microsoft be in a position where their Series S versions of games are quote-unquote oven-ready? Not only for Sony's handheld, but also for the Switch 2 and their own proper handheld, not the rebranded ROG. Also, could this be a winning strategy going forwards for last-gen libraries to become next-gen handheld libraries, extending the lifespan of aging consoles and keeping lower performance targets relevant? There's an additional possibility to consider, of course. What if PS6 games can scale down enough to run on Sony's portable? Then surely they could also run on PS5. What a conundrum. Yeah, interesting points there. I mean, Alex, I mean, you literally just said it. You've raised the
Good idea.
concept of the Series S being a kind of trailblazing device for a future handheld almost. But you would need to solve that memory bandwidth issue. The Series S has still got a lot of bandwidth compared to today's mobile devices. Maybe that's what has been solved. Who knows?
I mean, that would be an interesting thing. I have no idea what that hardware wise, or maybe it's, between the advent of like PS4, you had delta color compression as well as tiling stuff being added to GPUs to make them much more efficient. So maybe there is actually some hardware breakthrough that we don't know about.
Yeah, right? I think, one of the hardware breakthroughs will be that we will be on a different microarchitecture for the GPU. Which we don't know anything about at the moment. But it should be backwards compatible, which I think is going to be crucial for both Microsoft and Sony. So they're seeing an opportunity there. And I think, if you look back at the Series S, why didn't it quite hit the target? I think it's lack of memory. I don't see that being a problem. I mean, ROG Ally, Steam Deck, 16 gigs of memory, it's kind of established now. You kind of solved that problem. It's just the bandwidth side of things, I think, that's going to be challenging there. And I love this idea of last-gen libraries becoming next-gen handheld libraries, because, a good game is a good game, and it's not as if PS4 games look bad. Scale down to handheld, perfect. And yes, this additional possibility, PS6 games being able to scale down enough to run on Sony's portable. I mean, within reason, I think that's doable, and the Series S has kind of borne that out almost. And the fact that if you're going to be releasing a game on PC, it's as well, it's got to be scalable across a huge range of hardware. So I think that scalability is going to become much more of a thing for first-party developers. Final thoughts, Alex?
Yeah, the scalability thing, I think we've talked about this in the past, and I've stressed that I imagine that the next generation would have an even longer, more extended cross-generation period than even now, which was extremely long, I felt. And I think hardware like this, as well as the Series S, would just make that an inevitability. Just the cost of games and whatnot, and having to scale lower for now having PCs added into the mix for Sony games, I think this kind of product actually makes quite a lot of sense.